Before we begin, a quick addendum to our previous Broad Peak report. In that report, we said that Mallory Geis had been recovered from the mountain. That information has since been corrected. Mallory Geis was not fully recovered. According to the latest information from the Alpine Club of Pakistan, only a leg believed to belong to Mallory was recovered. The rest of her remains are still on Broad Peak. We wanted to make that correction clearly before continuing. And with that important update made, today we want to step away from the avalanche for a moment and tell you who Mallory Geis was, how she found climbing, and why Broad Peak became the mountain she chose. There is something particularly haunting about a dream that ends just as it's beginning. Because when somebody has climbed mountains for 30 years, when they have stood on a summit after summit, when sometimes we look at their final expedition as the last chapter of a very long book. But Mallory Geis was different. Broad Peak wasn't supposed to be the final chapter. It was supposed to be chapter 1.
And that's what makes her story so difficult. Because most people first heard the name Mallory Geis on July 30th, 2026, an American woman, 39 years old, missing after an avalanche on Broad Peak, and within hours, her name was being placed beside some of the most experienced high-altitude climbers in the world, Nirmal Purja, Sohail Saki, Nadira Al-Harthi, Kilu Pemba Sherpa. These were people with enormous Himalaya and Karakoram experience. Mallory wasn't at that point yet. Broad Peak was her first 8,000-meter expedition. Explorers Web reported before the accident that she had previously climbed several 6,000-meter mountains in Nepal and that she had met Sohail Saki during one of those climbs.
And that means if we only tell you how Mallory died, we completely miss the story, because the more interesting question is, how does somebody living an established life in San Antonio, Texas, reach a point where she closes the business she spent years building, buys expedition boots, and travels halfway around the world, and finds herself beneath one of the highest mountains on Earth? That's the story we're telling today. And then toward the end, we need to address something difficult, because there was considerable confusion after the Broad Peak avalanche about whether Mallory had been recovered. She had not. And as of the latest official reporting we found, most of her remains are still somewhere on Broad Peak. You know, there is something about mountains that cameras never quite capture. You can take a photograph, you can record a video, you can post the view on Instagram, but the lens flattens everything. It cannot really show you what your eyes see when you are standing there. And it certainly cannot show you what you feel. When you're climbing, especially when you're exhausted, something strange happens. You keep looking upward, you come around a corner or over a ridge and think, this has to be it. That must be the top. You've already worked so hard to get there. Your lungs are burning, your legs are tired, and for a few seconds, you convince yourself that you finally arrived. Then you come around that corner, and another enormous face of the mountain appears just above you. And suddenly, there is this strange combination of disappointment and absolute awe, because you realize you haven't climbed the mountain yet. There's still an entire mountain above you.
And from the bottom, mountains look enormous, almost impossible.
Yeah, they do. But there is another strange moment that happens when you finally get high enough to look back down. Everything that seemed enormous below suddenly becomes very small. The roads disappear, the buildings disappear, and people disappear completely. Things that occupied your entire mind down there, arguments, deadlines, anxieties, expectations, become almost impossible to see. And for a moment, you realize how small you really are. Maybe in a depressing way, but most times it's almost the opposite. You begin to understand that you're just one tiny drop in something unimaginably vast. And somehow there can be peace in that. At that bottom, your mind can become noisy. You're thinking about the climb, the weather, the route, whether you're strong enough, whether you've made the right decision, or whether something is going to go wrong. But sometimes high on the mountain, that noise disappears. There's only the next step, then the next one, and then another.
which is probably why people keep going back to the mountains.
Yeah, maybe. But mountains also have a brutal way of humbling that feeling because reaching the top can trick you into thinking you've conquered something, the mountain, or fear, or maybe even yourself. And then the mountain gives you a rather rude reminder there is nowhere higher to go. You've reached the summit. Now what? You still have to descend. You still have to go home. And when you get home, you're still you. You cannot permanently escape yourself just by climbing higher. You cannot live forever inside that extraordinary clarity that comes when the only things that matter are breathing, moving, and staying alive. Eventually, the ordinary world returns, and perhaps that's the lesson. Maybe discovering who you are isn't something waiting for you one perfect summit at a time. Maybe it happens in thousands of smaller moments, a decision, a friendship, a failure, a journey, a mountain, coming home, starting again. Each one revealing something you couldn't see before. And maybe that's why Mallory Geis' story is worth telling from the beginning, because Broad Peak was not simply a mountain she decided to climb. By the time she arrived beneath it, she had already begun climbing something else entirely. She had begun changing her life, and she was still discovering where that climb might lead.
Let's begin far away from Pakistan, San Antonio, Texas. And I think the first thing worth saying is that Mallory's life wasn't some empty space waiting for mountaineering to fill it. She had work, she had family, she had close friendships stretching back to childhood. She had built a business, she was involved in her community. Her father, George Geis, also told Kens that Mallory worked alongside him in the family's San Antonio real estate business. CNN's reporting also identified her as a former board member of San Antonio Sports.
And one of the most revealing descriptions of Mallory doesn't actually come from another climber. It comes from a woman named Caitlin Anthony. She was interviewed after Mallory's death, and Anthony said the two women were born only about a month apart. They had known each other essentially their entire lives. They went to different schools. Mallory attended St. Mary's Hall and later attended college in different parts of the country. But the friendship survived all of it: childhood, school, college, their 20s, and even their 30s.
And that matters because Caitlin witnessed the change, not the avalanche, not Broad Peak, but the transformation before the Broad Peak. She described Mallory as someone who didn't tend to do things halfway, whether it came to school, sports, work, and then opening her own Pilates studio. Her friend remembered being amazed by how much Mallory managed to juggle while somehow doing it with humility.
Which brings us to something I find fascinating about this story. For years, Mallory's relationship with the body was professional. Pilates, movement, strength. She always focused on helping other people feel better in their bodies. According to material from Mallory's own February 2026 post, later summarized by the Primetimer, having her own studio and helping people through movement had been a dream she had carried for more than 10 years. Think about that. This wasn't something she casually tried for 6 months. It had been one of her dreams. She built it, she achieved it, and then something completely changed.
This is perhaps the most relatable part of Mallory's story. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't failing to achieve your dream,
Mhm.
sometimes it's achieving it and discovering that you have changed.
Exactly. And Mallory seems to have wrestled with that. Her own February post, as subsequently reported, explained that the decision to leave the studio had taken more than a year. She apparently struggled with the idea that walking away from something she had worked so hard to create might look selfish or it might look like a failure. But eventually, she came to another conclusion. People grow, and sometimes their dreams are allowed to change with them.
That's an enormous difference. She wasn't running from something that had collapsed. She was choosing to leave something she had successfully built.
And her childhood friend noticed the same transformation from the outside.
Yeah.
Caitlin Anthony told KSAT that as Mallory approached the end of her 30s, her priorities began shifting. She described it very simply. Mallory decided she wanted to start experiencing the adventure. Then came the travel, the long treks, then the mountains, and eventually the Pilates studio closed.
And her social media history paints the same picture. KSAT looked through years of Mallory's posts and found a life increasingly filled with the travel and outdoor experiences. Everest Base Camp, Costa Rica, Jordan, and other destinations.
But there's a crucial distinction here. Travel isn't mountaineering. Everest Base Camp isn't Broad Peak. Somewhere between being somebody who loved the outdoors and somebody preparing for an 8,000-meter expedition, another transition happened.
Hmm.
Nepal appears to have been one of the places where that transition became serious. Various news reports have looked back through Mallory's climbing record and all of her social media posts and identified at least two important Nepalese summits. And those are Lobuche East, approximately 6,119 meters, and Mera Peak, another major Himalayan trekking/mountaineering objective. Those weren't 8,000-meter mountains, but they weren't casual hikes either. Many of these lower peaks require far more technical skills than even an Everest climb.
And this is where another person enters the story. Sohail Saki, the Pakistani climber from Hunza, who would eventually accompany Mallory onto Broad Peak.
Yeah, that's one of the pieces I actually want to remember. Mallory did not first meet Sohail at Broad Peak Base Camp. Their climbing connection apparently predated Pakistan, and that helps explain something else: trust. Because if you're going to attempt your first 8,000er, the person climbing beside you matters enormously. Mallory entrusted Sohail's experience for that first 8,000-meter attempt.
And Sohail was a very different climber from Mallory in terms of experience. By then, Explorers Web reported that he had already submitted Pakistan's other 8,000-meter mountains, K2, Nanga Parbat, and other Gasherbums, without supplemental oxygen. Broad Peak was missing from his list. So this was his last one.
Yes, and there was another interesting decision. Sohail strongly identified with the no oxygen climbing because he had his own goals and endeavors in mind. But that on Broad Peak, he intended to use supplemental oxygen. Why? Because this time he wasn't simply responsible for himself. He was guiding Mallory. That tiny detail tells you something important about his relationship with her. His style was changing because his responsibility had changed.
Of course, there's a danger in telling Mallory's story after the fact. It's very easy to divide everyone into two categories, expert or inexperienced. The
Right.
reality is messier. Mallory had mountain experience, but she also knew that she was learning.
Yeah, and perhaps the best evidence comes from another climber, Kimberly Hardman, an Alaska based mountaineer who met Mallory at a women's ice climbing week in Colorado in January 2026. Hardman told the Associated Press and KSAT that Mallory was relatively new to ice climbing, but she described her as naturally athletic. More importantly, she said Mallory wasn't approaching the mountains blindly. She respected the risk and she wanted to learn.
Apparently, they connected immediately
Yep.
and started talking about mountains they could climb together around the world, future plans and excitement that were left undone.
Yes, the undone. This is what makes it so difficult to look back on because this was January 2026, only 6 months before Broad Peak. Her climbing life still felt like something opening in front of her. It's kind of haunting because January 2026 isn't ancient history. She's attending a women's ice climbing weekend. She's learning, she's making new climbing friends, she's talking about future objectives. Her world is just opening, not closing.
Little did she know what was going to happen in her very new future.
Yes, very, very haunting thought, actually. Then comes February 20th, 2026. And if this were a film, this is probably where I would slow everything down because Mallory publishes the post announcing that her Pilates chapter is ending. She talks about life pushing her towards something she hadn't expected. She had resisted starting over, but eventually she decides to do it anyway. Her phrase was, a giant leap of faith into the unknown. And then she predicted that her next chapter would probably contain plenty of helmets, harnesses, and crampons.
Reading that after Broad Peak is very
Oh,
difficult.
it is. But I don't want to read it as a death premonition because that's not what it was. It was optimism, and that's important. We know what happened next, but Mallory actually didn't. To her, that sentence meant new places, new skills, new friends, new mountains, maybe years of climbing ahead.
And I think that changes how we should interpret the entire Broad Peak Expedition 2026. It wasn't, I've done everything else, now I need the ultimate mountain.
Hmm.
It seems much closer to like, I have finally decided this is the life I want to explore.
Yeah, and maybe that question of fear matters here because only a few weeks later, Mallory would make a decision that had nothing to do with ice climbing, but everything to do with uncertainty. She was about to walk away from something she had spent years building. And this move of hers had me thinking about a quote I read recently. Seneca, a famous Roman philosopher, wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." And I started thinking about climbing. Before you even leave the ground, your mind has already imagined the fall, the storm, the exhaustion, everything that could go wrong. But once you're actually climbing, there is only the next step. What do you think that means for someone like Mallory?
Maybe a part of adventure is discovering which fears are warning you
Yeah,
and which ones are simply keeping you from living, just like Seneca.
absolutely. On June 18th, she actually updated another post, and this one almost sounds playful. Mallory has her new expedition boots. She jokes about them, then announces where she's going: Pakistan. Her first really big climbing expedition, Broad Peak, the 12th highest mountain in the world. And there's something about those boots that makes the story human because expedition photography often makes mountaineers look almost superhuman. Down suits, ice axes, oxygen masks, goggles, they look cool. But buying your own first serious pair of expedition boots, whew, that's familiar. Anyone who has entered a new sport knows that feeling. You buy the equipment, and suddenly the thing you've been dreaming about becomes so real. Those aren't just boots anymore. Those boots mean I'm actually going. It's motivating, it's exciting.
And here's the obvious question: why would your first 8,000er be Broad Peak?
Well, we should be careful here because I haven't found a reliable published interview in which Mallory herself explicitly lays out the details or a list of reasons for choosing Broad Peak. So I don't want to invent them.
Of course.
What we can document is this: she had already climbed with Sohail. Sohail had enormous experience on Pakistan's high mountains. Broad Peak was one of the Pakistan 8,000ers he had himself not submitted. We already know this. And Mallory was specifically heading there under his guidance for her first 8,000er.
So the guide relationship matters.
Oh, enormously.
But there is still an obvious question here. If Mallory had never climbed an 8,000er mountain before, why Broad Peak? Why make the jump from 6,000-meter peaks in Nepal to a mountain more than 8 kilometers above the sea level?
Yeah, Totally. I understand all of those questions. They're really important questions. And this is where Broad Peak's reputation matters because if you only know Broad Peak from what happened in July 2026, you might assume that Mallory had deliberately chosen one of the most notoriously deadly mountains on Earth. Historically, that's not really how Broad Peak has been regarded. Among the 14 8,000-meter mountains, Broad Peak has generally carried a comparatively lower uh,
Historical fatality ratio?
yes, the fatality ratio. One recent compilation of mountaineering statistics puts its historical death to summit ratio at roughly 5%, around 5 recorded deaths for every 100 successful summits. For comparison, the same compilation places K2 far higher, historically around 20 to 25%, and Annapurna 1 at roughly 30%. Now, we have to be careful with those numbers. That does not mean somebody climbing Broad Peak has a 5% chance of dying. Deaths divided by successful summits is not the same thing as deaths divided by every person who attempted the mountain. But it does help explain Broad Peak's reputation within the very unusual world of the 8,000-meter climbing experience.
So, comparatively speaking, it wasn't considered one of the worst places to begin with.
Comparatively, no. And that word is doing a lot of work
Yeah.
because there is no genuinely safe 8,000-meter mountain, but Broad Peak's normal route is generally considered less technical and less technically complicated than something like K2.
Mm-hmm.
You're not dealing with K2's sustained technical difficulty or its infamous bottleneck beneath that hanging serac. That is so incredibly scary.
Yeah.
That makes Broad Peak attractive to climbers who already have substantial high altitude experience and want to make the transition to an 8,000er. Looking back over nearly 70 years of fatalities after the 2026 disaster, there was a clear distinction that Broad Peak has never been the deadliest of the 8,000ers. But if you look at the other side of the equation, relative accessibility does not remove objective danger. Broad Peak has killed climbers through avalanches, falls, exhaustion, altitude illness, and also storms and disappearances. And one particular part of the mountain has repeatedly demanded respect. That's the descent.
Every mountain.
Oh, yeah. The summit itself isn't simply a point sitting conveniently above Camp 3. Climbers first reach a col and then face a long, exposed summit ridge. There can be cornices, wind, very, very strong wind. The kind when it slams against you, you could be knocked right off your feet. There's poor visibility, extreme fatigue could be setting in, and after somebody has spent hours climbing at enormous altitude, the route still has to be reversed. Many reviews found a clear pattern. Many Broad Peak fatalities occurred after climbers had already reached their objective and were actually coming down.
Which creates an interesting contradiction. It's an 8,000er that can look comparatively approachable on paper, but you're still standing on an 8,051-meter mountain in the Karakoram.
Exactly. And perhaps that is the part of the answer to why Broad Peak made sense for Mallory. She wasn't apparently choosing K2 as her first 8,000er. That's obvious. She had already climbed at altitude. She had climbed Mera Peak and Lobuche East in Nepal. She had been developing technical skills, and most importantly, she wasn't planning to climb Broad Peak alone. She would be climbing with Sohail Saki, someone she already knew from climbing in Nepal and someone with extensive experience on Pakistan's 8,000-meter mountains. So, from the perspective she would have had before July 2026, the decision doesn't necessarily look as extraordinary as it does when we look backward or in hindsight through the avalanche. There was progression. There were 6,000-meter peaks, technical training, a trusted, experienced Pakistani climbing partner, and then an 8,000er that, within that extreme category of mountains, had historically been viewed as comparatively attainable.
And hindsight changes everything.
Oh, it totally does. Because today, when we hear the words Broad Peak, we immediately think of July 30th. That's been forever changed. Mallory couldn't do that. She was making her decision using the history that existed before July 30th. But for us, it's different. We now have that historical mark in our books because we're still here.
Yep.
And before that morning, Broad Peak's history contained tragedies, certainly, but it was not regarded in the same category of lethality as K2 or Annapurna. Annapurna is so incredibly dangerous,
Yep.
so technical. And in fact, before the 2026 avalanche, the reports counted at least 39 recorded fatalities on Broad Peak since its first ascent in 1957. Then, in a single event, 10 more people were added to that and were lost. Nearly 70 years of climbing history, and one morning dramatically altered the way an entire generation will remember that mountain.
So perhaps the question shouldn't be, why would Mallory choose such a deadly mountain?
No. A fair question is, why did Broad Peak appear to be a reasonable next mountain
Yep.
for the climber Mallory was becoming? And when you look at her progression, her relationship with Sohail and Broad Peak's reputation before the disaster, the choice begins to make considerably more sense. And Broad Peak, despite its reputation as one of the comparatively more straightforward 8,000ers, technically on its standard route, is still an 8,000-meter Karakoram mountain.
It of course is.
Yeah, there's no easy version of that. The weather, the altitude, the avalanche exposure, there's rock falls, crevices, and long periods being above 7,000 meters. And eventually the enormous summit ridge. So this was still a huge jump. By early July, Mallory and Sohail are moving toward Broad Peak. And one reason we can reconstruct this expedition unusually well is that the Explorers Web was already reporting on Broad Peak before anyone knew a disaster was coming. On July 3rd, Angela Benavides reported that Sohail was on his way to Broad Peak with Mallory.
Meanwhile, the mountain was already active.
Yes, that's right.
David Klein of Hungary and Ian Overton of the United States had been among the first foreign climbers working on Broad Peak that season. A Karakoram expedition's Pakistani rope team was fixing toward the upper camps. Mallory and Sohail were arriving into an expedition season already taking shape.
Yeah, and by later July, Mallory and Sohail had completed their acclimatization work. Equipment had been positioned high on the mountain, and they were just waiting, which in high altitude climbing is sometimes the hardest part. You can train, you can acclimatize, you can prepare, but ultimately you wait for the mountain to give you a window. You must ask the mountain for a safe passage.
Always. And this is where the tone of the story changes because the weather wasn't behaving cleanly.
No, not at all. On July 27th, reporting describes conflicting forecasts, actually. One forecast prompted a late season summit push towards July 31st. Okay, that means they should, or they've been recommended to wait until July 31st before any attempts. At almost the same time, other climbers were backing off. The neighboring mountains, like the Gasherbrum objectives, two Spanish climbers reported finding roughly about 40 centimeters of fresh snow at Camp 1 and believed conditions higher up could be dangerous. That's another mountain. So we should not pretend it directly proves what the Broad Peak snowpack was doing, but it demonstrates how unsettling the conditions across the whole Karakoram range were.
And Ian Overton had already left the Broad Peak.
Yes. After being on Broad Peak earlier in July, Overton later reported that a major windstorm had struck on the night of July 18th. And during his descent, he describes the benches between Camp 3 and Camp 2 as carrying wind, crust, and very punchy snow, while the lower terrain was unconsolidated and it was melting rapidly. He and Klein left the area on July 25th after disliking the forecast. But the way the summit attempts are, they don't just happen in one go. There are several climbs done up a little further each time, and then they have to climb back down to rest in order to acclimatize. Now, that means they would have to go across the avalanche terrain at least a couple times. So very experienced climbers and those who pretty much live there don't have to do the high camp acclimatizations.
So does that mean Mallory's group shouldn't have climbed?
That's a very good question. We can't make that leap because different climbers and also different dates, different forecasts, different observations, and nobody looking at this from a laptop afterward gets to pretend they were standing on a slope making that decision. So the observations are a part of the record and they're important because they tell us the mountain had recently experienced wind, snowfall, and also changing conditions.
And
So,
different people have, different perception of danger.
oh, absolutely. We learned that
Yeah.
very quickly just the other day, climbing a mountain. On Wednesday, July 29th, the Broad Peak climbers reached Camp 2. According to information reported, the plan was to move toward Camp 3 and then continue to the summit push. But this wasn't one neat 10-person expedition walking in a single company formation. Several organizations had climbers on the mountains. There was Elite Expedition, Imagine Nepal, Seven Summits Trek, and Mallory with Sohail. And Sohail actually had just finalized the name of his company, which was Moving Mountains. And all their objectives happened to converge on the same section of Broad Peak.
And then comes the morning of July 30th.
Yes. Sometime just before approximately 9:30 a.m. Pakistan time, the climbers were ascending between Camp 2 and Camp 3, around the 6,600 meter level. Then the trackers changed. Instead of continuing upward, several suddenly began dropping hundreds of meters. Explorers Web examined the tracker data and reported that the ascent of multiple climbers stopped at a roughly the same time.
And you know what? Across the glacier on K2, somebody actually saw it happen.
Oh,
Yeah.
we have an eyewitness account. Yes, that was Jen Lama. He was involved with the Seven Summits trek in the K2 operation. He said he was moving between camps on K2 when he saw a massive powder avalanche descending Broad Peak, apparently involving releases from two areas. Wow. He immediately tried radioing Gayalu Sherpa and Nuang Tindu Sherpa. There was no response. He contacted K2 Base Camp and also asked them to continue trying the climbers and to check with the other expedition organizers. There still was nothing.
And at first, silence alone didn't necessarily mean disaster.
Exactly. High altitude climbers sometimes switch radios off to preserve their batteries. This happens often. Sohail had turned off his real-time live tracking on his Garmin InReach tracker. And one organization may know where its own climbers are without knowing precisely where everybody else is. Broad Peak Base Camp also did not have seamless real-time communications, even though Mallory's Garmin InReach and her live tracking was actually turned on. So what happened wasn't immediately obvious in its entire full scale. Then they began checking the satellite trackers, and the tracks actually looked wrong, very wrong.
Oh,
Yeah, Mallory's tracker alongside those of several other climbers, their tracks showed the abrupt loss of altitude following the avalanche. So approximately at 9:30 a.m., the ascent stopped, followed by an abrupt sideways downhill descent by several hundred meters. And that was obviously after the avalanche. Some climbers were swept extraordinarily far. Nirmal Purja's tracker suggested a fall of roughly 800 meters, and Nadira Al-Harti's tracker extended almost toward the base of the mountain. And that's more than a full vertical mile. For Mallory, the signal indicated movement down and sideways following the slide. But there is something else that we should actually emphasize. We don't know exactly what Mallory experienced in those final seconds. We don't know what she said. We don't know whether Sohail was immediately beside her. We don't know whether anyone had time to react. Maybe at some point the cameras attached to them, if they were on and recording at that exact moment, if they are ever recovered, may provide those details. But I think, however, those details should just be left out. There are experts who are trained to analyze those things. It's not something the entire general public can handle knowing, like you can't unsee or unhear things.
Because sometimes saying we don't know is more respectful than constructing dialogue nobody heard.
Yeah, exactly. Then the information coming out of the mountain became confusing.
Very confusing.
Early reports said 4 bodies had been recovered. Then that was corrected. Explorers Web reported on July 31st that only Nadira Al Hardi and Pur Bahadur Gurung Yukta had actually been retrieved.
Yeah, at that stage.
At that stage, yes. Sohail's backpack and a broken Garmin device had reportedly been found. Then came reports saying Mallory's body had been recovered. And then those reports went everywhere. Associated Press, CNN, American local news. And her family in Texas was told information in that environment of rapidly changing reports.
But that wasn't ultimately correct.
No. And this is where we need to be extremely precise. On August 1st, Explorers Web reported that authorities had clarified that a body part belonging to Mallory had been found above Camp 1 near the remains of Yukta Gurung and Nadira El Harti, not her complete body. And several days later, the Alpine Club of Pakistan became even more specific. On August 7th, Dawn Press published an update based on information from Ayaz Shigri, who is the Secretary General of the Alpine Club of Pakistan. And because this is such a sensitive subject, I'm going to state it clinically and only once. Shigri said that a leg believed to be Mallory Geis's had been recovered and also airlifted, while the rest of her body had not been recovered.
So those early reports saying her body was in Skardu were wrong.
Yes. Or more accurately, they were based on early information that was later corrected. And Dawn Press repeated the clarification again on August 8th. Mallory remained one of the 3 climbers whose remains had not been fully recovered. So it's not 2, it was 3.
Yeah.
And the other 2 were Sohail Saki, who has not been found, and Noang Tindu Sherpa. Noang's body had reportedly been located, but it's laying in a dangerous avalanche-prone position where rescuers actually could not retrieve it safely. Sohail had still not been located. And for Mallory, only the partial remains already recovered had been found.
And what about others?
Well, by August 7th, the Alpine Club of Pakistan told Dawn Press that the 7 bodies had been recovered and airlifted to Skardu. 5 of those brought down in one phase were Nirmal Purja, Wang Jong, Nima Sherpa, Gayalu Sherpa, and Kilu Pemba Sherpa. Yukta Gurung and Nadira Al Hardi had been recovered earlier, so they pretty much got brought down the mountain right away. The recovery itself was described by the ACP as one of the most technically difficult and dangerous operations undertaken on Broad Peak. And this is important. The rescuers were moving through the same unstable mountain environment that had just killed 10 people. They weren't recovering bodies from a safe hiking trail. They were exposing themselves to the same avalanche terrain during their entire rescue mission. A live avalanche actually happened again, and they nearly escaped.
And now we come to the question families inevitably ask. Why stop? If Mallory is still there, if Sohail is still there, why not keep searching?
Oh, I know, and probably I would be asking those same questions too if I was the family members. It hurts not having your loved one back after such a tragedy, so you can say goodbye. But by August 8th, rescuers believed continuing had become much too dangerous. Dawn Press reported that after 8 days of searching, the operation was suspended because of continuing danger from additional avalanches and also worsening conditions. Ayaz Shigri said the mission would resume when the weather improves and the area is safe again. Rescuers intended to return when the conditions permit.
So it's suspended, not officially abandoned.
Yes, that's exactly the distinction. And I just want to add, I don't think there's ever really a safe period. There might be like safe windows within certain seasons, but it's never safe.
Yeah, but haven't the Karakoram expeditions already closed for the season then?
Yes, they have. Explorers Web reported on August 1st that the Broad Peak disaster effectively ended the commercial Karakoram 8,000 meter season. So all commercial expeditions were canceled as climbers redirected their attention toward the actual rescue and recovery effort. And I do believe a lot of climbers would believe it's kind of a bad omen to keep climbing and go for their summit dreams after such a tragedy and disaster.
I agree.
Yeah. So, but the end of the climbing season does not mean a recovery mission is legally or practically impossible. Those are different things. A commercial expedition is attempting to put clients on a summit, and a recovery expedition is going onto the mountain for a specific humanitarian purpose and traversing unrouted terrains. And the Alpine Club of Pakistan's latest statement is significant because it did not say the search has ended permanently. It said the operation was suspended and teams would return when the conditions are safe enough.
Could that mean this year then?
Possibly, but we should not promise that. The Karakoram is already moving deeper toward late season conditions. So that means fresh snowfall can make avalanche terrain worse, weather windows become less reliable, and high altitude access becomes increasingly difficult. Also, the helicopters have severe operational limitations at these elevations. So there are really three possibilities. A short, safe window opens and all the rescuers attempt another operation, or the conditions remain unacceptable and they postpone the recovery until a later period, or the mountain changes enough, maybe snowfall, ice movement, avalanches, and the crevices, and that locating the remains becomes substantially harder. As of the latest official report I found on August 8th, the commitment is still to return when the safety permits.
And that brings us back to taxes.
Yes, because one of the earliest things Mallory's father told local television after learning of her death was very simple. The family wanted their daughter home. George Geis described her as positive, intelligent, and somebody capable of doing almost anything she set her mind to. And he said that their focus was bringing her back to San Antonio. At that time, he said that the family was operating under all of the early reports suggesting that Mallory had actually been recovered. We now know the situation was very different, which makes that statement particularly painful. Her family wants to be able to say goodbye to her one last time, but right now she is still missing.
But her closest friend said something else. Something I think we should end with. Caitlin Anthony said she didn't want Mallory's life reduced to the way she died. She wanted people to remember the joy, the photographs, the huge smile from mountaintops and from different places around the world, because that's where her friend believed Mallory had found something important.
Yes, and perhaps that's the fairest way to tell the story. Because on July 30th, Broad Peak became the place where Mallory Geis died. But it wasn't why she went there. She didn't travel to Pakistan looking for tragedy. She went looking for possibility. A few months earlier, she had done something many people think about, but never actually do. She looked at the life she had built. It was a successful life, a respectable life. It was a really comfortable life. And she admitted, I want something different now. That takes courage of its own kind. There is an image that I keep returning to. It's not the avalanche, it's not the trackers, but it's those boots. A woman in Texas preparing for her first 8,000 meter expedition, excited enough to joke about whether those boots could carry her all the way up Broad Peak. Because in that moment, everything was still ahead of her. There was hope, there was excitement.
More mountains, more countries, more climbing partners, more skills to learn, maybe another 6,000er, maybe another 8,000er. Nobody knows.
And that's perhaps the tragedy hidden beneath the larger Broad Peak tragedy. When someone like Nirmal Purja died on that mountain, The world looked backward at an extraordinary mountaineering career. When Sohail Saki died, Pakistan looked back at an experienced climber who already stood on its great 8,000-meter summits, just one shy. But when we look at Mallory, we're almost forced to look forward at the career that didn't happen yet, and maybe at all the mountains that were still possibilities, at a life she had only recently given herself permission to reinvent.
Her friend said she had begun choosing adventure.
And she did. Nepal, Mera Peak, Lobuche East, ice climbing in Colorado, and a friendship with Sohail Saki. And then Pakistan, going to see the beauty of it. And then Broad Peak. Not because she believed she was invincible. The people who climbed with her said the opposite, that she respected the mountains and understood that the risk was real. She simply decided that fear wasn't going to choose her life for her. And there's a difference between recklessness and accepting that anything worth deeply experiencing carries some uncertainty.
Today, a part of Mallory Geis remains somewhere high on Broad Peak. Sohail Saki remains missing. Nawang Tindu Sherpa has reportedly been located, but recovery has been judged too dangerous. The commercial climbing season is over. The mountain has become quieter, and winter will eventually return. But that recovery effort is paused, not formally abandoned. If weather and avalanche conditions allow rescuers to return safely, officials say they intend to do so.
Yeah, and perhaps one day Mallory will make the final journey that her father wanted from Broad Peak to Skardu and eventually home. Until then, we should be careful about the words we use. She had not been fully recovered. She has not come home. And her story is not simply American climber killed on Broad Peak. She shouldn't have been there. Her story is actually about a woman who reached 39, looked at the life she had created, and had the courage to admit that her dream had changed. She closed one door, she bought a pair of expedition boots, and she walked towards the mountains.
Mallory Geis, 39 years old, San Antonio, Texas, climber, traveler, daughter, friend, and someone whose great mountaineering adventure had only just begun.
And may she rest in peace, and may all 10 climbers lost on Broad Peak be remembered not simply for the mountain that took them, but for the lives that brought them there. It's incredibly courageous to take chances, to document them, to be criticized by them. But in the end, the most important message for all of us to actually see is that hope, the reminder that life is about continually reinventing yourself. Life will linearly move forward, but along the way, life forms its circle. So it's kind of like a spiral going in a circle